This is the Movies and Bob Sitton speaking, and on the 12th of November at the New Yorker Theater, Emile De Antonio's newest film, In the Year of the Pig, will open. Mr. De Antonio's earlier films include the films Rush to Judgment, which was about the assassination of John Kennedy, and the earlier Point of Order about the Army McCarthy hearings. In the Year of the Pig, D, is about Vietnam, and it involves probably the most extensive use of varieties of footage of films that I've ever seen. Where did you get all of this film?
Well, the film that is used in The Year of the Pig, outside of the material I shot, comes, as you say, from about as wide a variety as I know of. Some of it comes from the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, what we call Hanoi, which I got through the Democratic Republic of Vietnam's ambassador in Paris, Mai Van Bo. Some of it comes from the National Liberation Front, which I got from their public relations officer in Prague. Some of it is Soviet footage, some is East German, some is Czech. But an even larger amount is American footage from the American Broadcasting Company, from United Press International, from Paramount News, from British and French sources. And as I say, most of it was material I've shot.
Mm-hmm. Included are some interviews with former officials of the State Department and other government officials that were involved in Vietnam from the 40s to the present. And I found among many of the film's many salient features that these interviews were very impressive. They were people that ordinarily you would consider very straight, very conservative in their way. And they were telling things about Vietnam that were just very compelling facts that speak for themselves, that add up to the injustice of the U.S. involvement. Did you shoot these interviews live, or did you get those interviews by other means?
No, those interviews were shot live. I began all of those interviews by stating the position of the picture, by saying that the film regarded the United States intervention in Vietnam from the beginning as immoral, unjust, impractical, and stupid. And we went on from there. Now, some of the people you refer to, a man like Kenneth Landon, who was a high officer in the State Department as far back as 1941, and his wife wrote Anna and the King of Siam, which later became The King and I. Kenneth Landon is now retired. He's been out of the State Department a long time. He was there when FDR was president, and it was he who received that now famous memo in which FDR said, "The French must not be allowed to return to Indochina," signed FDR. I find that, I can cite another example or two, like Charlton Ogburn, who was actually head of what the State Department calls the Vietnamese desk. Mr. Ogburn was head of the Vietnamese desk in 1946. And Senator Morton, who was an important Republican member of the Senate when I filmed him in 1968. These people all were out of the government, or about to be out, as in the case of Senator Morton, which I think you can almost make it a rule of thumb that people who have left the government can speak with greater force than people who are still in the government.
The Morton interview particularly impressed me when he said that Ho Chi Minh is regarded by the people of Vietnam, and by that he means not just the people of the North, but also the people of the South, as the George Washington of his country. I don't think I've ever heard a U.S. senator of any political stripe make such a statement.
Well, frankly, neither had I. But in fact, of course, not only is it interesting that Senator Morton said this, but it also happens to be true. As Senator Morton pointed out, and as others in the film pointed out, former President Eisenhower was quoted as saying, had the elections been held in 1956, Ho Chi Minh would have won in the South by 80% of the votes. And it was our government, of course, which prevented the election of 1956.
Mm-hmm. We were talking before we started the interview about compelling reasons for U.S. involvement in Vietnam, and people in the U.S. concerned about the question have been, I think, looking for whether there are or ever have been any compelling reasons. By that I mean some sort of rational justification, say a grab for natural riches or some other justification for U.S. involvement. In your film, you explain the involvement in terms of the agreements that we made with the French and with respect to the Soviet threat and justifications of that sort, which are, to me, again, perhaps the real reasons that we have been in Vietnam. But do you think there's anything beyond that? Is it possible to come up with any kind of justification at all for U.S. involvement?
Well, as I say, I began this film with the very deep feeling that there was absolutely no justification under the sun for our war in Vietnam. There are economic reasons for it being there, and again, President Eisenhower pointed them out. There are vast deposits of tungsten, particularly in the north. There are coal and steel in the north. There are question mark amounts of oil. And the south, of course, was the rice basin of all of Southeast Asia. But these reasons alone, that's old-fashioned Marxist. That's Lenin writing about imperialism in 1917. Mm-hmm. That isn't a sufficient reason for the kind of war that we're engaged in. Most large movements in history are in part accidental and are out of the control of single individuals. But yet I feel that our ante was raised in 1949. The nature of our commitment to the French, the nature of our war thereafter was the whole commitment was raised because of the success of the Chinese Revolution in 1949. And it was then that under John Foster Dulles, but with the agreement of Eisenhower and surely with the abundant agreement of the Pentagon and the Chiefs of Staff, that we began a holy war, a religious war. If you think of the Protestants and Catholics in Europe in the 16th century, you get to something similar. A religious war of the so-called, I say, free world against the communist world. And it is this that has made the war so difficult for us. Mm-hmm. And it is this that has made the war so difficult for liberals. We mustn't forget that it was the liberals, it was Arthur Schlesinger and his friends who supported the increment of our war and its escalation, a word that came in under Johnson. But the escalation of that war is far back before 1961, but even as far back as 61 when we really upped the ante. John Fitzgerald Kennedy is as much to blame for raising that ante as Lyndon B. Johnson. It's one thing to have 535 troops there. You can get 535 troops out with 3 airplanes. This was prior to Kennedy. But when Kennedy raised the ante to 17,000, then we'd planted the flag. We were there then. You can't take 17,000 men on. That's in an overnight operation. Then you've escalated.
In your film, In the Year of the Pig, one of Kennedy's former aides expresses the opinion that he does not feel that Kennedy would have involved us militarily, that he would not have escalated the war into anywhere near its present state. Do you think this is
Well, that's Roger Hilsman, who was Assistant Secretary of State for Far Eastern Affairs and was former Director of Intelligence in the State Department. And Hilsman, I think quite properly, although he doesn't give the reason for it, I think the reason is that the Kennedys were such extraordinarily pragmatic people. And I think the Kennedys could see, in some cases because of their advisors, in some cases because of their very keen pragmatic sense, where certain policies might lead. And I agree. I don't think that John Fitzgerald Kennedy would have gone ahead in Vietnam, although he did start raising the ante. I don't think he would have gone ahead in the almost mad way that Johnson did.
Mm-hmm. Your film also points out that JFK was a member of the American Friends of Vietnam, which was a pro-Gem organization. Do you think that was purely coincidental, or that he understood what was going on?
No, absolutely not. This is why John Fitzgerald Kennedy's a still of his father, appears in the film, because Diem, by the way, D in Vietnamese is pronounced like Z. Diem, right. D-I-E-M is Diem. Diem was really supported when he was back here, living in a Catholic seminary in New Jersey, originally by Cardinal Spellman, then by Joseph Kennedy, the father of President Kennedy and Senator Robert F. Kennedy, by Senator Mike Mansfield, who was also a member of the American Friends of Vietnam. Other people belonging to American Friends of Vietnam include American military personnel and professional people who almost look as if they had some connection with the CIA, like Leo Chern, of the International Refugee Committee, people who've always taken strong Cold War positions. All these people were Cold Warriors in one way or another. And these were the original American Friends of Vietnam. All you had to do was look at that list to see how phony it was. I mean, they were the American Friends of American Intervention, not the American Friends of Vietnam.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They were the American Friends of puppets in Vietnam, like Diem. Senator McCarthy, Eugene McCarthy, since I made a film about Joseph R.B., Senator Eugene McCarthy said something very interesting recently. He said that he was at a briefing given by the administration in 1964, and that Secretary of State Rusk got up and said, "We now at last have a stable government in Vietnam, General Khan." And just as Rusk was giving that briefing to 15 invited senators, at that very moment, given the time difference between Saigon and Washington, General Khan's government was being toppled.
Mm-hmm.
We looked for puppets, like a puppeteer going out of business. We had to find them one after the other, and we did produce them until we produced these two people we have now. When you think about the war in Vietnam, I think nothing symbolizes it more clearly. This is why I put General Key in the film to such an extent, than the fact that while the so-called Viet Minh were fighting for the independence of their country against the French, General Thieu, President Thieu now, was fighting in the French army, and General Key fought with the French Air Force in Algeria. Both of these people served with the French. The closest analog I can think of, and it's been used by other people, would be the same thing as electing Benedict Arnold, the first president of the United States.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Your film points out that the American Friends of Vietnam was a lobbying organization on behalf of the Diem regime. Do you think that it was a particularly potent force in shaping U.S. policy?
It was incredibly potent because it really represented the liberal establishment of this country. And it became more potent, of course, right after the election of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Because, as I say, these same people, like Arthur Schlesinger, supported Diem. I talked to former Ambassador Galbraith last week in Cambridge, and he pointed out that he was against the Vietnamese commitment from the beginning, including the 1961 period. And, but of course, his voice, although not a strong voice at that time, was still a voice in the wilderness, because it was precisely, it was the liberals who created the big escalation of the Vietnamese War. Walt Rostow, McGeorge Bundy, Rusk, Schlesinger. It wasn't a bunch of rabid right-wingers. Mm-hmm. It was the very people the right wing hated.
Yeah.
It was the so-called left-wing liberal establishment.
Going back to 1949 and the situation that resulted there, do you think that there was ever any basis in fact for the feeling that the Chinese were a threat in Indochina?
Well, every country, when it shakes out of revolution, as the Chinese did in 1949, and you can just look at any number of examples, ordinarily is in a relatively weakened position. China just fought an exhausting civil war, and exhaustive too. And traditionally, as you know, the Chinese and Vietnamese have been enemies. And the fact that each of them was ruled by a Marxist government did not suddenly mean that 2,000 years of history are going to be wiped out. The Chinese invaded Vietnam for the first time in 111 before Christ in the Han Dynasty. And they fought for 1,000 years until Vietnam became free in 936 AD. And they're traditional enemies. I cannot see myself, and this is hindsight, that the Chinese would have been likely to invade Indochina, Vietnam. The Chinese, after all, the only invasion we can attribute to them, and they've filed quite a case for it, is Tibet. The business with India was simply a tiny border dispute, which again, for which the Chinese, you can make a good case for the Chinese, as good a case as you can for the Indians. But the Chinese have not been expansionist. They have not broken out of the bounds of their own country. I think that we were in the grip. I think all religious wars have to do with panic and unholy fear. All of them, from the beginning, from the Muslim wars against everybody, from the Christian wars of slaughter and extinction, from the old Jewish wars before in the Old Testament, Hebrew wars. I think all religious wars are irrational, and I think our war was a religious war and irrational. I think John Foster Dulles, with his attempt to impose a narrow Protestant, almost mad view of the world, he gave communism more strength than it deserved or had. That view in the State Department was that communism was a huge, rugged, impenetrable, monolithic organization, where in fact it was already crumbling. Tito had already broken off. Stalin had already written off the Greek communists and given them, in a sense, written off the Greek war. And everything that has happened since then simply leads us to believe. It was Dean Rusk who in 1951 said the Chinese Communist government does not represent the people of China, it's a Russian puppet. That's in 51, when any rational person could see that it wasn't going to turn out that way. And it's also Castro and everybody else. I mean, one thing that the Russians have learned, the people who believed most in the Cold War are the Russians and the Americans. This is the thing that's so mad, so really insane. The Soviet Union and the U.S. are the two people who accepted all the assumptions of the Cold War. And as we keep going on, we can see that in the communist world we have extraordinary splits, as we do now in our so-called Western world.
I think the war in Vietnam shows the irrelevance of a purely economic understanding of the world, and shows that international politics and engagements of this sort have to be understood also on a kind of mythological level, a level of paranoia,
absolutely,
of psychological fear, deep-seated needs, and so forth. That kind of level of understanding.
If you have a minute, I'd like to say one
Sure.
brief thing on that. It was a Vietnamese from the north who told me in France. He said, one thing neither the French, who understood us better than the Americans do, but one thing neither the French nor the Americans understand is that our revolutionaries were romantics. For years and generations, the people who led our wars against the French and then under the Marxists came from the background of teachers and intellectuals. They weren't professional military people. General Jacques was a history teacher, for example. They came from classes that aren't ordinarily associated with the military. They were romantics. For instance, Ho Chi Minh's father never heard the word communism, never heard the words Karl Marx, but he was on the wanted list of the French because he wanted freedom for his country. He wanted Vietnam for the Vietnamese. And that's what most Vietnamese want right now, and in the simplest possible way. This is what we're preventing. The economic thing gets curious now. We have such an investment there that I think it is economic now, in part.
Really?
We've made Cam Ranh Bay the biggest harbor, at this point probably in Asia, probably bigger than the great British harbor that was built at Singapore. It's the biggest deep water harbor in Asia. Our whole fleet can go in there, and merchant ships, and there are air bases around it. This thing represents a cost of over, I think somebody told me, it's $1.5 billion. You know what $1.5 billion could do in the ghetto here? Well, it represents a cost of $1.5 billion. That's not the kind of investment we're going to walk away from. I don't think we went in for economic reasons, but I don't think we can ever leave that kind of place.
Yeah. The war has built its own economy and fed upon itself.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Your film is the third of your feature films, and they've all dealt with political topics, which raises the inevitable question of the teaching function, or the propagandistic function, if you will, of films of this sort. Given the moratorium, the recent moratorium, and the widespread feeling throughout even the mainstream of the United States that the war is indefensible, that the points made in your film are being heard already, what sort of teaching function or propagandistic function do you see your film?
Well, as you know, Bob, I made the film first, I suppose, as a film, but also as propaganda. And I'm happy to say that during the October 15th moratorium, the film played at 25 universities. And that is during the day of the 15th. And that Contemporary Films, which is distributing the film, tells me now that it's going to be in 50 colleges and universities for the November 13th, 14th, 15th ceremonies from March Against Death through the moratorium. So, you know, I'm very pleased with this. I'm also pleased that the film has been seen in a good many other countries on television, and not Eastern Europe. I mean, Finland, Sweden, Denmark, Holland, Belgium, and curiously enough, its most successful run has been in Paris, where it played in a very good theater and where Cahiers du Cinema did a long article. And it had a very long run in Paris, and now we're opening here in New York.
Well, my feeling when I saw it was that the filmmaker may have in mind addressing this film to those large numbers of people who have yet not understood the problems of Vietnam. I mean, I must say that from the point of view of my point of view, I've been involved in, concerned about the war for some time. The film didn't contain, I couldn't say it contained new information, but that's not to to take away from detract from the film, it's the juxtaposition of information was, of course, unique, and I feel it's the most comprehensive film on the subject of Vietnam that I've ever seen. And I wondered whether you were addressing yourself to an audience of unconverted, of people that had not yet considered the problems of Vietnam. I mean, maybe there are more of those around than we think.
Well, I don't really know what the answer to that is, Bob. I mean, I hope this doesn't sound fatuous, but my films are, first of all, made for me. I mean, I have to like the damn thing, and then we go from there. And, I mean, every filmmaker wants to reach the widest audience, and what I have a great faith in is the really extraordinary capacity of film to reveal in a way that books and the linear media can't. I think that when you see Ho Chi Minh making his bed, which lots of people write off as cheap propaganda, but everybody who's ever been there will tell you that he lived in exactly that way. When you see him with his Salem cigarettes hanging from his lips, typing at his little portable, you suddenly get a view about, in a sense, what it's like to be with it. You know, stripped of all the trappings of power and everything else. And it's this kind of thing that I think reveals to people, and it's this kind of thing that I hope young people will see and think about, and not accept what's in the film necessarily. But think about why it is that, you know, did I fake it? Was I taken in by film that the North Vietnamese gave me? Or do you think it's possible that it really was like this? I mean, I hope that people will respond actively. I'll never hope to get the response I got in Chicago.
What happened there?
Well, I gave the film as a benefit for the conspiracy for Dave Dellinger and Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin, and that was the warmest and most sincere criticism of any film that I know. They first of all threatened to kill me, and they threatened to bomb the theater, and they threatened to bomb the owner of the theater, and on the opening night of the film there were 5 police cars with flashing lights. Of course, we have to understand that the word pig in Chicago has a slightly different meaning than it does anywhere else in this country. And every cop in Chicago, because there's a lot of press about it in television, thought that in the year of the pig had something to do with police.
How about in other locations? Have you had any similar responses?
No, the picture ran for 6 or 7 weeks in Boston, which is a long time for a documentary, in a very good theater, the Symphony. And there, people were very friendly, and the reviews were really great. And there were no threats or no noises or murmurs. Chicago really is somewhat different. I love Chicago. It's a wild and active place. But as I say, the word pig there is susceptible of so many interpretations. People said to me on Chicago, I mean, on television, a woman asked me, does the word pig refer to the police? And I said, no. As a matter of fact, the title, excuse me, In the Year of the Pig was chosen before the Chicago Convention of 1968. But I am willing to include Mayor Daley and the Chicago Police in the title, although it clearly had nothing to do with it.
So many of your films have involved television footage, particularly Point of Order, which was all TV footage of the Army McCarthy hearings. Have you ever had difficulty getting footage? Or what's the availability of TV footage for this purpose?
Well, the whole history of acquiring footage is, anybody who's ever done it knows that you're limited unless you have tremendous amounts of money, and even then it's limited. I felt after getting the footage for Point of Order that I was the victim of a holdup. I still feel that way. Dan Talbot and I and our partners paid CBS, and believe me, neither Dan Talbot nor I had this kind of money, paid CBS $50,000 in front just to get hold of the footage. And CBS is a permanent partner and receives 50% of whatever happens. Well, you can see when you cut in distributors and everything else that the producing end tends to get smaller and smaller.
Do you feel that television footage ought to be made available free or more available?
Well, this is something that I wish your audience would get excited about, and people in this country, because I think it's only if you get a lot of people doing this that things can be changed. I've been in correspondence over the past, and Variety's actually done a pretty long article about this, about with the Federal Communications Commission. I've been in correspondence with the Federal Communications Commission about the fact that if this is our air that you and I are using, and the same thing is true of television air, it's the air of the American people. And it seems to me that what I suggested to the FCC is that the 3 major networks should set up a national electronics archive so that everything, that which is used and unused, that are done in the news media, on television, would be made available to scholars, historians, filmmakers, at cost. This means that the networks would have to, out of their own pockets, build a huge building which would house this material, that they would have to pay for a trained and competent staff of film librarians, catalogers, etc., and that there'd be projection facilities, viewing facilities. And this is not unreasonable. We're talking about only 20 or 30 million tops. And, the gross profit for CBS alone in 1967, I think, was 90 million for 1 year.
Mm-hmm.
This kind of thing could be written off over 10 years, so it only come to cost them less than $1 million apiece.
Mm-hmm.
And we owe it to the country. When people say to me, "You're un-American," I say, I can't tell you over the air what I say, but I say nonsense. People have stopped really caring about this country. And if we did, we'd be concerned with our past. The networks used to throw everything away, except what they could sell for a profit. It seems to me our history on film and on tape is going to be a matter of consuming and passionate interest to people 50 years from now, 10 years from now. We don't seem to care about about that period.
Yeah.
And it should be free. Why should CBS have the footage of Kennedy's assassination? They're only there because they have a monopoly.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody else can go and film with the freedom that the three networks have. If you say, "Mr. Nixon, I want to film your next speech," they'd probably lock you up.
Mm-hmm.
Or they would lock me up, at any rate, if I asked for this.
Yeah. I think that I would go further than to say that it's just our air. It's I think also the real substance of American history, that what is happening in our country today is happening on film in some sort, in reality. That this is the level of existence that we're operating on. If you want to know what happened in the case of RFK's assassination or JFK's assassination, that I think on film is a kind of item of public property. It's we find the situation that the networks that created this material either throw it away, destroy it, or at least they do control the access to it. And in the first place, they alone or almost exclusively were allowed to film it. I know,
right.
You just can't go in and shoot a film of anyone, and the availability of the information to begin with is severely limited.
No, and it even works in another way, since politics today is directed to the media. And when an important politician has anything to say, the first thing his staff does is call in CBS, NBC, and ABC. It begins there. Mm-hmm. They would never dream of calling WBAI or of Emile De Antonio, Mm-hmm. The act, in a sense, is created on the air. Yeah. It begins with that concept in mind. And this is why it is the history of our country. You could write, if it could be written, the history of the Civil War, the American Revolution, with the tools of the time, with words and recollections of people, etc., interviews, historians. But the history of our time, as you say, exists on film, whether it's Hitler chewing the rug at Compiègne in 1940, or whether it's John F. Kennedy slumped in his car on the way to the Parkland Memorial Hospital in Dallas.
Mm-hmm.
This is where it is.
Right. Well, Dee, it's fascinating to talk with you. We have just one more minute, and I wanted to ask you about what you're doing next. I know you're working on a film.
Well, I'm doing a film like I've never done before. It has to do primarily with colleges and with television. It's a film about what I think is the last best hope of operating within the system in this country, which was Senator Eugene McCarthy's '68 campaign. And it's a long film, and McCarthy's in it. We've been shooting him. But also a lot of the kids who helped to make that campaign, kids who ran the New Hampshire primary, and a lot of enemies of McCarthy, too. Mm-hmm. And Noam Chomsky is in it. He's going to do a critique from the left. In other words, why you can't operate from within the system. It's a kind of looking at, is it possible to operate within the system through the vote and everything else?
Mm-hmm. What's the result going to be in the film?
Well, the result is going to be that I suspect you can't do it, but that I think McCarthy gave it sort of the greatest try, and that, that it seemed to me that the system would have been justified, and a lot of problems we have now would have been circumvented if the system hadn't crushed McCarthy's bid for election.
Sounds a bit like a feature-length version of Troublemakers. You remember Fruchter's Mackover?
Right.
Fruchter's film about the Income Project in Newark, which was, I think, a really incisive chronicle of the collapse of working within a system. Well, we've got to go. It's been delightful talking with you. I hope you can come back again, particularly after the McCarthy film.
Thank you, Bob.
Great talking with you. We've been talking with Emile De Antonio, whose new film, In the Year of the Pig, opens on the 12th at the New Yorker Theater. This is Bob Sitton on the Movies.